Hello everyone. Welcome to the third video in the Oligopoly series of videos. This will be the final video before the practice quiz video. And in this section of the video, we are going to be diving more deeply into game theory. So I briefly mentioned game theory at the end of the previous video. And I said that game theory is a tool that economists have sort of borrowed from math that we can use to analyze or kind of summarize the behaviors of oligopoly firms. So, backtracking a little bit, remember that oligopoly firms profits, what quantity they choose to sell, and the price that they choose to sell it at is interdependent among all of the firms in the oligopoly. In other words, the profits and the quantity of one firm in the oligopoly depends on the behaviors and decisions about quantities and prices that the other firms decide to make. So the profits between these two firms are dependent on the decisions and behaviors of all other firms in the oligopoly. And I mentioned at the end of the last video that, analyzing this kind of situation can become really complicated and really hard because all of these behaviors are dependent on one another. So it's kind of difficult to kind of summarize, potential outcomes in these oligopoly situations using, a supply and demand graph. It's kind of difficult to do that. So economists have borrowed some tools from game theory to make this kind of, analyzing oligopolies a little bit easier and a little bit more straightforward than just sitting there and thinking through all the possible decisions that these firms can make. So to kind of give game theory a formal definition, you can think of game theory as a branch of mathematics that analyzes situations in which players must make decisions and then receive payoffs based on what other players decide to do. So, to summarize that definition, basically, game theory looks at interdependent behaviors of different individuals, of different companies, of different countries even, and analyzes what the outcomes of these interdependent actors are. So one really kind of famous situation that is analyzed using game theory is called the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a scenario in which the gains from cooperation are larger than the rewards from pursuing self-interest. So this may seem a little bit familiar to us if we have watched the last video. So we learned in the last video that if the two oligopoly firms that we talked about, if AT&T and Verizon, stuck to their agreement to act like a monopoly, both of their profits would be higher if they stuck to that agreement. But there is this pull, there's this urge for both of these firms to want to cheat on that agreement and act in their own self-interest. So there is this desire for both AT&T and Verizon to want to try to undercut the other firm and cheat on the agreement. And we saw that if both firms cheat on the agreement, both firms earn less profits than what they would have if they stuck to the agreement. So this oligopoly example fits right into this prisoner's dilemma type situation that is really famous in game theory. We can call the prisoner's dilemma kind of like the economics of cooperation, which is kind of like a cool application in economics. I don't know if WVU has a game theory class, but when I was an undergrad, I was able to take an entire class just on game theory. And what we would do is we would like analyze just different situations and try to predict what the different outcomes would be, based on different people's or different businesses' decisions. It's really a cool and fascinating subject. If you Google it, you can see there's lots and lots of videos and work written about game theory. So to kind of make this prisoner's dilemma example maybe stick in your head a little bit more, I decided to go through an example with you guys using actual prisoners to see where this dilemma kind of got its name from. So the outcome, to give you a preview, the outcome of this prisoner's dilemma is the exact same outcome as what we saw with the oligopoly firms. It's better for both parties to want to cooperate with one another, but there is an urge for both of these parties separately to want to cheat on the agreement, to act self-interested. So let's go through this example together and we can see how this example plays out using some of the tools in game theory. So the police have caught Bonnie and Clyde, two suspected bank robbers, but the cops only have enough evidence to imprison each for 1 year. So the police catch these two bank robbers, but they don't really have enough evidence as of now to send both of them to prison for a long time. So the police decide to question each of these prisoners in separate rooms and offer each prisoner the following deal. So they have Bonnie in one room and they have Clyde in another room. And they separately say to each of them, if you confess and say your partner planned the robbery, so if you confess to committing the crime, but you blame it on the other person, we're going to let you go free. But if you do not confess and decide to remain silent, and your partner, if the other guy says you planned it, you're going to get 20 years in prison and they get to go free. And if both of you blame the other person, you're each going to get 8 years in prison. So this sounds like a pretty, complicated logic problem to think through right off the bat. There are lots of different outcomes that can happen to each Bonnie and Clyde, depending on what the other player decides to do. So we can use some tools from game theory to kind of analyze the situation in a little bit more concise way. So one tool that is used in game theory is called a game matrix. Now, you're not going to have to make this matrix for an exam or a test or anything. There probably won't even be a matrix on the exam in any form, but it is a useful way to kind of summarize all of the previous thoughts and outcomes from the previous slide. So we can kind of put all of these different outcomes into this game matrix. So on this part of the matrix, we have the two different decisions that Clyde could pursue. So both Bonnie and Clyde have two different decisions that they could pursue. So Clyde could either confess to the crime and blame Bonnie, or he could just remain silent and not rat her out. Bonnie can also do the same thing. She could either confess and say that Clyde was the one that planned the robbery, or remain silent and not rat Clyde out. So based on these four different decisions, we can kind of summarize all of the different outcomes that will happen to both of these two players. So let's start with the first possible decision that Clyde would make. So let's assume that Clyde decides to confess and say, yes, I was part of this robbery, but it wasn't my fault. It was Bonnie's fault. Bonnie was the one that planned this entire robbery. So if Clyde decides to confess, what is going to happen to Bonnie? Well, it depends on what Bonnie decides to do. So if Bonnie remains silent, doesn't say anything, if Clyde says she was the one that did it, she's going to get 20 years in prison. But if Bonnie also decides to confess and say, yeah, sure, I was part of the robbery, but it was Clyde's fault. So if they both point the finger at each other, Bonnie is going to get 8 years in prison. What if Clyde decides to remain silent? What's going to happen to Bonnie? Well, it depends on what Bonnie decides to do. If Clyde remains silent and Bonnie points the finger at Clyde and says, yes, I was part of the robbery, but it was Clyde's fault. If Clyde didn't say anything, Bonnie gets to go free. So if Clyde remains silent and doesn't talk to the cops, and Bonnie remains silent and doesn't talk to the cops, Bonnie's going to get 1 year in prison because the cops don't have any more evidence to convict either one for any longer. So these are the kind of four different outcomes that could happen to Bonnie based on the two decisions that Clyde can make. So we can also figure out what's going to happen to Clyde based on Bonnie's two decisions. So going the other way now, Bonnie has two different decisions to make as well. She can confess and point the finger at Clyde, or she can remain silent and not tell the cops any more information. If Bonnie decides to confess, and Clyde also decided to confess, Clyde is going to get 8 years in prison. So again, this is the situation where they're pointing the finger at one another and blaming the other person for planning the bank robbery. If Bonnie points the finger at Clyde and Clyde didn't say anything, if he decided to remain silent, he's going to get 20 years in prison. Now, what if Bonnie decides to remain silent? What are the two different outcomes for Clyde? Well, if Bonnie decides to remain silent and Clyde confessed and pointed the finger at Bonnie, Clyde gets to go free. But if Bonnie didn't tell the cops anything and Clyde didn't tell the cops anything, Clyde gets 1 year in prison. So again, hopefully this kind of game matrix makes these different outcomes a little bit more clear and summarized for you guys to analyze, what Bonnie and what Clyde might think is the best decision for them to make. So now we can kind of go through and compare the different outcomes to figure out what decision both players should make based on these outcomes. So let's start with Clyde. So if Bonnie decides to confess, which of these two outcomes for Clyde is better? Clyde getting 8 years or Clyde getting 20 years? Well, obviously, Clyde doesn't want to spend a lot of time in jail. So if Bonnie confesses, Clyde should also confess because this gets him the better of the two outcomes. What if Bonnie decides to remain silent? What should Clyde do? Clyde goes free or Clyde gets 1 year? Between these two options, Clyde going free sounds a lot better than going to jail for 1 year, right? So if Bonnie confesses or if Bonnie remains silent, the better outcome for Clyde happens here. So no matter what Bonnie does, Clyde is going to confess and point the finger at Bonnie if he is self-interested and wants to minimize his jail time, which logically makes sense. So no matter what Bonnie does, Clyde is going to confess because this gets him less prison in both situations. Now let's look at Bonnie. So if Clyde decides to confess, the two different outcomes for Bonnie are Bonnie gets 8 years or Bonnie gets 20 years. What would be Bonnie's desired outcome between these two? Well, it would be Bonnie getting 8 years, right? She gets less time in jail if she also confesses. So if Clyde confesses, Bonnie should confess. But what if Clyde remains silent? What are two outcomes for Bonnie? Bonnie goes free or Bonnie gets 1 year? Which of these two is a better outcome for Bonnie? Bonnie goes free. So to get this outcome, if Clyde decides to remain silent, Bonnie should confess. So again, if Clyde confesses or Clyde remains silent, Bonnie is better off in both of those situations by also confessing. So because this risk of potentially, remaining silent and the other person confessing on you, because that risk is there's this desire to want to kind of cheat on this agreement and break the silence and blame the other person for the crime. So, in this situation, we call confessing a dominant strategy. So basically, a dominant strategy is both players get better outcomes by confessing and blaming the other person for the crime, rather than remaining silent. So this is kind of really an interesting outcome that, if we look to the square here, and we see that if they both agreed, like going in before the, police started questioning them, if they agreed beforehand to not tell the cops anything, and if they both remained silent, the cops only had enough information to put them away for 1 year each. But now that both Bonnie and Clyde, given this, situation that the cops have kind of set up for them, given this situation and these, really high prison outcomes if they get blamed, this forces both of them to want to confess and break the agreement. So this forces them not to cooperate, but to kind of act in a self-interested way. And even if they cooperated and both get 1 year, this would have been a better outcome than if they confess, right? But there is that drive for them to be self-interested and not risk going to prison for 20 years. So because confessing is the dominant strategy for both players confess on the other one. They blame the other person because they're too afraid of remaining silent, and the other person blames them. So because this is a dominant strategy, both Bonnie and Clyde end up going to jail for 8 years each. And this both confess is also a Nash equilibrium. We introduced this idea of Nash equilibrium in the previous video. So remember, a Nash equilibrium is making the most or the best decision for you given the behaviors of other players in the game. So both Bonnie and Clyde are making the best decision that they can based on what they think the other person is going to do. And even though cooperation would get them a better outcome, self-interest drives them to want to break any kind of agreement that they may have had and confess on one another. So this is kind of like a summary and an analysis of the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. So again, to kind of summarize the outcome here, Bonnie and Clyde both confess and each get 8 years in prison. And as we can see from the previous slide, both would have been better off if they just kept their mouths shut and remained silent, because the cops didn't have enough, information about the robbery to put them away in jail for longer. But even if Bonnie and Clyde had agreed before caught to remain silent, the logic of self-interest takes over and leads them to confess. So we can kind of use this outcome in this pretty silly example of the prisoner's dilemma to also summarize what we talked about with oligopolies and the kind of decision making of oligopolies that we talked about through kind of like that long, complicated example in the previous video can be summarized using this prisoner's dilemma game matrix again. But instead of Bonnie and Clyde, we could have AT&T and Verizon. So again, to kind of set the stage, when oligopolies form a cartel, or if they make an agreement amongst themselves to produce a lower quantity and charge a higher price, they hope to reach the monopoly outcome. Or in other words, they hope to make a really, really high profit if they choose to charge a higher price and produce a lower quantity. But when they decide to do this and set the stage for potential cooperation, they kind of open the doors to a prisoner's dilemma. So again, just to kind of come back to this AT&T and Verizon example, remember AT&T and Verizon were a duopolist in a small town providing cell phone service plans. And a duopoly is just an oligopoly with 2 firms in it. And the cartel outcome, or the collusion outcome, maximized their profits. So each firm agreed to serve 30 customers in the previous video. So this was the monopoly outcome, is that they both produce 30 cell phone plans. So we can kind of summarize the different outcomes in this case. So for Bonnie and Clyde, it was years in prison were the different outcomes they could get. For AT&T and Verizon, it is the different profits that they can make by producing different quantities. So if, AT&T and Verizon both produce the monopoly outcome, AT&T and Verizon will make $900 each. They will split the monopoly profit right down the middle and walk away with $900 each. However, in addition to producing the monopoly outcome, they can also produce a higher quantity to try to undercut the other person or the other competitor here. So if AT&T decides to cheat on the agreement and produce 40, depending on what Verizon does, Verizon could get undercut and make $750, or they can make $800 if they also cheat. And the same thing with Verizon. Verizon could also decide to cheat. And what happens to AT&T's profits? Well, if AT&T stuck to the agreement and Verizon cheated, AT&T would get undercut and walked away with $750. But if AT&T also decides to cheat, they could at least walk away with $800 in that case. So again, even though both would be better off if they stuck to the agreement, there's this desire for both of them to want to cheat, because there's this possibility that the other person is also going to cheat on the agreement. So again, in this situation, each firm's dominant strategy is to want to cheat on this monopoly agreement. And even though that they'd be better off if they stuck to the agreement, there is that uncertainty about what the other player is going to do. And to kind of mitigate that risk, they're just going to say, well, they might cheat, I might as well just cheat because I'm better off no matter what if I cheat on the agreement. So hopefully this explanation of the prisoner's dilemma was kind of a useful way, fun way to go about explaining how kind of complicated this interdependent behavior of oligopolies actually is. And we can use this prisoner's dilemma setup in game theory to analyze a whole ton of different situations that exist in the real world. So one example could be an ad war campaign, or you can even think of this as like a political ad war campaign. So there could be, the players could be two different businesses or two different political candidates that spend millions on TV ads to try to steal business from each other. Each firm's ad cancels out the effects of the other, and both firms' profits fall by the cost of the ads. So, even though both firms know that making more ads is, if they both agree to not make as many ads, then both would be better off. They wouldn't be cutting into their profits by making more ads, but there's this incentive to want to maybe run one more ad than the other person to maybe attract more business. And if one player is thinking that, the other player is also thinking that too. So both people, both players, both businesses decide to run as many ads as possible, which severely cuts into their profits compared to if they just kind of stuck to an agreement to not run as many ads. We can also analyze the behaviors of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. So member countries in OPEC tried to kind of act like a cartel. They agreed to limit oil production in certain situations to try to boost oil prices and the profits of member countries. So again, if all the countries in OPEC agree to cut down on the supply of oil, this boosts the price of oil for everyone and increases the profits for everyone. But again, if only one country decides to cheat and undercut everyone else, this one company that cheats is going to make a lot more in profit compared to everyone else that just got cheated on. So there's an incentive, therefore, for not one country to want to cheat, but for all the countries to want to cheat. So a lot of times, this cartel or this agreement that they may have amongst each other is really hard to keep. It's really hard to enforce because there is this drive for every country to be self-interested and not want to get cheated on. Another example you can use in the context of game theory, more particularly the prisoner's dilemma, is an arms race between military superpowers. So analyzing the Cold War and nuclear weapon production between the United States and Russia is another really good example of a prisoner's dilemma. Each country would probably be better off by cooperating and agreeing not to produce as many nuclear weapons, but there is this desire to be self-interested and think, oh no, what if the other country produces more nuclear weapons than me? Then I won't have as much and I'm not as protected or safe anymore. So I might as well cheat on the agreement and make more nuclear weapons just in case they do. And even if they don't, then I'd be better off because I'd be the one that had the most nuclear weapons. So we can use the prisoner's dilemma to talk about arms races between military superpowers. Common resources is another example of a prisoner's dilemma situation. And we're going to talk about common resources maybe in 2 weeks from now when we talk about negative externalities. So common resources will come up again in the future, but we can use the prisoner's dilemma and game theory to kind of analyze what happens with common resources. So a common resource is basically a resource that anyone can have access to. So a pretty, common example of a common resource is like a lake that has fish in it, and anyone can come and fish at the lake and get as many fish as they want. So everyone that wants to use the lake for fishing would be better off if not everyone tried to take all the fish for themselves, but each person has this dominant strategy to want to overuse the resource, overfish the lake, because they don't want to be the one left without any fish at the end of the day. So analyzing common resources is another example of the prisoner's dilemma. So we kind of talked about the oligopoly behavior from the point of view of game theory. And on this last slide of the lecture notes, I kind of wanted to explain, what does this really mean for society? What does it mean to society if the common outcome is for oligopolists to cheat on monopoly agreements? So if oligopolists decide to cheat on agreements, or we have this non-cooperative oligopoly equilibrium, what does this mean for the welfare of society? And I guess it really depends on the group and society that we're talking about. So like we've already learned in the last videos, oligopolists that decide to cheat on agreements, even though it's in their best interest to cheat on the agreement, given the behavior of other players, it may be bad for them at the end of the day because this prevents them from achieving those higher profits. So it may be bad for oligopolists to cheat on agreements. It may also be bad for society if oligopolists decide to cheat on agreements. So again, this really depends on the context in the industry and the firms that we're talking about. But things like the arms race game and the common resource game that I mentioned in the previous slides, if there are cheating oligopolists producing weapons, that means there's going to be a huge influx in weapons production. This could potentially be detrimental to society if there is this, increase in weapons production. It could also be detrimental to society if, lakes are overfished, if common resources are overused, because not everyone gets to use the resource anymore. So again, non-cooperating oligopolists may be bad for the oligopolists. They don't get profits anymore. It may be bad for society depending on the type of industry and firms that are cheating in this agreement. But at the end of the day, non-cooperative oligopolies may also be good for society, depending, again, on the industry and the firms that we're talking about. It may be good for society because we found that cheating oligopolists end up more closely looking like perfectly competitive firms. So if oligopolists stick to agreements and they collude with one another, they end up like a monopoly outcome. There's less output produced, charging a higher price, and the oligopolist firms make a high profit. If they cheat, however, this moves this industry closer to perfect competition, which has greater output at lower prices that maximizes kind of total welfare or total surplus for everyone in society, not just the oligopolist getting the profit. So again, cheating oligopolists could be good, could be bad for society, depending on the context and who we're really analyzing as benefiting or hurting in this situation. So I hope this video helped and was a useful way to explain kind of the outcome of oligopoly from a game theory perspective.